Good.
Hello, hello. I'm Stacy Hernandez, and I am one of the partners and college admissions advisors at the Best U. And we are here to present about the new SAT. And Bill Huston from MindFish is here to join us. And Bill and I go way, way, way back. And we've been partnering on a lot of things over many years. So I'm super psyched that you could be here, Bill. I don't know if you want to say anything else about yourself before we really start diving in.
Yeah, thanks, Stacy. I thought we were going to do a full practice SAT for the next 3 hours.
Yeah, no.
If you guys want to, I mean, we could just do a full practice SAT just to try it out. I know the next person that's coming in actually.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks, Stacy. Stacy and I met the other day to chat about this event tonight and realized that we've been collaborating for about 10 years, back since Stacy was the head of college counseling at an independent school. Yeah, it's super fun to be able to chat with you. Hi, Curry. How are you tonight? It's hi there. How's it going?
Oh, it's going okay. Thanks.
Great.
Awesome.
Great. Like Stacy said, we had 19 people sign up for this. We'll see how many people can make it. It might be a pretty small group. This should totally be kind of freewheeling. So if you have questions, feel free to just pop your questions into the chat. If it's, only the 6 of us, feel free to just click on your microphone and ask your questions out loud as well. I'm sure if any of you have a question about this, I'm sure other people in the room also do, because there's a lot of kind of uncertainty about this new digital SAT. It's very new. I'm sure everybody's got very similar questions. So don't hesitate to speak up and interrupt me and, get answers on what you need. Should we go ahead and just dive in, Stacy?
Yeah, let's dive in.
Okay.
And I'll just keep on checking for people and I may even throw in questions along the way to help support. So Bill's going to run the show more because this is his wheelhouse. You may have questions about college lists. I'm your person, but we'll let Bill handle the SAT piece. But I may jump in with some questions as well.
Awesome. And Stacy, I was joking with Stacy before you guys hopped on that I get the easy part of the job sometimes because we do the tests and then we're done. And right now, Stacy and her team at the Best U are in the thick of it with students applying for the November 1st early application deadline, which is next week. So it's kind of high season here in the college prep world. So yeah, thanks so much for having me, Stacy. I'm going to pull up my little PowerPoint here and I will share my screen and we will get rolling. Let me know if you guys can't see this for any reason. So yeah, we're here to talk about the new digital SAT, and it's brand new. Hasn't even been administered live yet in the United States. That will change early next year. And it's a pretty interesting time. The SAT's been in the news quite a lot because of this new digital test. Also because it's just been a hot button topic recently for many different reasons. I think higher ed in general and the college admissions process has been more in the mainstream news in the last year or so than any other time I remember in my career. And I've been doing this for over 20 years. So it's an interesting time for these tests. It's an interesting time for college admissions in general. And as I hinted at earlier, a lot of people have questions. So first, timeline on this digital test. They already launched the digital SAT internationally for the first time in March of this year, 2023. Students outside of the US took the live digital SAT. How many people here, you can feel free to jump on the chat or just like shout out. Are you guys the parents of juniors or seniors right now? I'd love to know. If you're the parent of a junior, your student may have taken the digital PSAT within the last couple of weeks. That was sort of the pilot of the digital testing platform here in the United States. And PSAT henceforth will be only available on the digital platform. The last version of the paper SAT which is going the way of the dinosaurs, is early December 2nd this year. And then after that, in March, we've got the first digital SAT in the US. And then I'm here in Colorado, as I know some of you are as well. We have a state mandated SAT, which will also be digital in April 2024. And so do a number of other states around the country. So let's talk about some of the differences between these two tests. What you're looking at here are the first 2 pages of the current version of the SAT. This is the reading test. So notice we've got about a page and a half of a passage. I'll give you guys 10 minutes. You can read this and I'll ask you some questions. Just kidding. This is what the old test looks like. You got about a page and a half of text. You only see 4 questions here, but there are actually 12 questions attached to these pages. So long passages and a bunch of questions attached to them. Again, this is the reading section. Here is a question from the new digital SAT. We'll talk about this more, but the digital test is basically a question by question test. We no longer have these long passages with a bunch of questions attached to them. And you can also see here, we've got some tools in the testing platform itself. So Zoom just kind of changed a little bit, but I'm going to draw on here. You can annotate the test. You can cross off answers. You can bookmark questions so you can come back later and review them. You've got a timer, which you can keep very close track of your time, etc., etc. Let's get rid of those annotations real quick. Oh boy, hold on a second. Give me 1 sec.
So you're saying that the students can do all of this during the test. They'll be able to mess around. So it's like they're writing on a piece of paper.
Yeah, they can basically write on the test. They also will get scratch paper, exactly up to 3 pages of scratch paper. And we're going to talk about that. So one big difference is, yeah, this is a digital test. Students are taking it on their screens and they are potentially doing work on paper in front of them and then going back to their screen. So this digital paper interface, which is a very relevant new feature of the new test for sure. We'll talk more about that, but this is a screenshot of the new testing platform. This is the official testing platform from the College Board. We'll get back to the platform in a second. Let's talk about some big picture differences between the new test and the old test. So the digital SAT is a shorter test overall. Surprise, surprise, students kind of like that. This test is about 2 hours and 15 minutes long. The old SAT is right around 3 hours long. So that's a significant difference. Students will take this on a computer or a tablet. My advice, don't do it on a tablet. It's much better on a laptop or even a desktop computer, but it's not a home test. Students will take this test at a testing center or at their school in the case of the state mandated tests. Another big difference, 3rd bullet on this page, the SAT is now what we call stage adaptive. If anybody here ever took the GRE or the GMAT at some point, those are also adaptive tests. And to be adaptive, a test inherently has to be digital. And so the SAT is joining those other tests, GMAT, GRE, in becoming a digital adaptive test. Now, we can go as far or as shallowly into the rabbit hole as we want to on a lot of these things, but stage adaptive quickly means the sections adapt based on your performance on an earlier section. And I'll contrast that with what we call question adaptive in a second. So the SAT has 4 sections. We start off with 2 verbal sections, which combine reading comprehension and English grammar. Your performance on the first one of those verbal sections determines which of 2 sections you get for the second section. So if you ace the first verbal section, you get the harder version of the second verbal section. If you do a bit less well on the first verbal section, you get the easier version of the second verbal section. So that's what I mean by stage adaptive. The test adapts based on your performance on the overall section that precedes the one that you're on. Now, what those sections do, the harder or the easier second verbal section in this example, is they kind of peg your score to a certain range. So if you get the harder section, you can score anywhere from 450 to a perfect 800 on the verbal part of the test as a whole. If you get the easier section, you're limited to a lower range. It's like 200 to 600, I believe. So it's interesting. The College Board thinks this is going to make for more accurate test results. They think it's going to be a better predictor of students' actual skill sets and academic backgrounds at the time they take the test. I think it has led to a little bit of anxiety among students. If you're on a question thinking, okay, I need to really do well on these questions so that I get the better version of the second section, that can add a little bit of stress to the process, but everyone's different. Other key differences, each test will actually be different than every other test with the new SAT, because they can basically on the digital platform just shuffle the questions and reform them, recombine them into almost infinite versions of the same test. So if a student is in a room with, let's say, 15 other test takers, everybody in that room is going to have a different test. Everybody taking it on that day will theoretically have a different test than one another. Because of this, the scales are going to be very opaque. The College Board is not planning to release scales for these new tests after they happen. There also used to be the service called the question and answer service, by which you could actually see the questions on the test you took. That will no longer be available anymore either. We already talked about these last two things, that there are some nice tools on the digital platform, but students do have scratch paper. I'm probably going to talk kind of quickly because I've always put together more information than we have time to get through. But again, if you have questions, ping me in the chat. It seems like maybe a few of you already did. And Stacy, feel free to let me know if any of those questions we should get to in the flow of this, or we should wait until after.
They're not questions. They're everyone has listed the grade of the students. So two juniors, no, 3 juniors, a sophomore, and a 9th grader.
Great. Well, all of those students are relevant. They're relevant ages for this new digital test for sure. Let's talk about the content of the test a little bit. Big change on the verbal side of the test is that the English grammar sections, which we call writing on the SAT, and the reading comprehension sections are now combined. So you could see a reading comprehension section followed by, or excuse me, a reading comprehension question followed by, let's say, a punctuation question, which is about English grammar. Those used to be 2 separate and distinct sections. Now they're all packaged together. We saw this earlier. The reading passages are very short. We're talking 3 to 5 sentences, and each have 1 question. That's it. There's only 1 question per reading passage. And if we go back, you guys saw this. So this is a reading question from the new SAT. Contrast that with this old style where we've got a page and a half of text and 12 questions. You know, I've joked about this when the College Board released the specs on the new test, that this is like, you know, reading comprehension for the Twitter generation or something like this. Some students definitely like the shorter format, and that makes sense. Others don't do as well at it, and we can talk about the differences in a second. But again, big difference in terms of the format and length of the reading and verbal sections. There are no grouped questions, no paired questions on the new test. And the second to last bullet on this particular page, there's overall less of a focus on vocabulary and idiomatic phrases on the SAT. That's true even in math, and we'll talk about that in a second. The language of the test, I think, has gotten a little more straightforward. Now, in a couple of minutes, we're going to compare SAT to ACT. Historically, the ACT is widely known as the test with more straightforward language, and the SAT is known to be the trickier of the 2 tests. I think that gap is narrowing a little bit. Not totally sure, but it seems like the way language is used on the new SAT is getting a little bit more straightforward. Let's talk about math. The core math on the tests, old SAT versus new SAT, is largely the same. They have some new, you know, fancy titles and labels for some of this stuff on the new test, but not that much has changed in terms of content. We're still talking about algebra, geometry, advanced math, which is basically algebra 2 and trigonometry, and then data analysis, which is essentially statistics, probability, this kind of stuff. The SAT has never had anything like calculus, or even really what we consider pre-calculus. People ask me that very often. Oh, my son or daughter is not in calculus yet. Should we wait to take the test? That's not what these tests are about. They start with a less advanced mathematical subject matter. And in some cases, the questions are still quite hard, but students don't need to have taken advanced math classes to take these tests. So the core math is basically the same. Big change over here on the calculator side of the math SAT. The current version, the paper version, which is going away in about 6 weeks, has 2 math sections, and students can only use a calculator on one of them. There's an entire math section that prohibits the use of a calculator. The new SAT, you can use a calculator on the whole thing. And I've got a screenshot on this slide of an online calculator system called Desmos. This thing, if students know how to use it, can really be a game changer on the new test. This is built in to the College Board's platform that I showed you earlier. It will straight up solve some of the math questions on the SAT if you know how to use it. Specifically, it can solve algebraic questions or coordinate geometry questions like we're looking at here. Now, most students, I would say, don't have familiarity with Desmos yet, but if they can learn it in the course of their preparation for the SAT, it can be a really, really powerful tool. You can also bring your own tried and true calculator to the new digital test as well. You can actually use both if you wanted to. But the fact that you can use a calculator for the entire math portion of this test is a popular change amongst students. I hinted at this earlier. The way the test is using language is much simpler. The current version of the paper SAT that students are taking in this calendar year has a lot of long and complex word problems, kind of deliberately confusing math word problems. Those are gone on the new test. Like we saw with the reading passages, the math questions are generally going to be shorter, generally going to be less wordy. Now, a little bit of a spoiler alert for a couple slides later. This has an impact on how all students will interface with this test. It also has an impact specifically on neurodivergent students and how they're going to experience this test. The new SAT is very interesting from that perspective, and we'll get into that in a couple of minutes. This is a key question. What do the colleges think of this new SAT? Well, the College Board, which writes and administers the SAT, is a well-oiled public relations machine. So they basically have the colleges on their side. The colleges are good with the new test. And I don't mean to be cynical and say that they shouldn't accept the new test, but the College Board made darn sure of that before rolling this thing out. So old and new SAT are going to be treated equally in the college's minds. The second bullet here, College Board is even saying students can super score across the paper and digital versions of the SAT. Now, some of you who may also have had older students go through this process may know what super scoring is. Super scoring means a student can take the test multiple times, many times as they want, and sort of cherry pick their best section. So let's say you take the SAT 3 times. Super score allows a student to combine their very best verbal score with their very best math score and put it together as a super score. College Board is saying, in theory, a student could take the December SAT this year and then take, let's say, the March SAT in 2024. Let's say they crush the verbal section in December and ace the math section in March. They can take those two, one paper verbal section, one digital math section, and put them together as a super score. Now, there's still a little bit of uncertainty around this. It seems like the decision whether or not to accept super score across paper and digital tests is up to the colleges themselves at the end of the day. But there are a lot of colleges that have already gone on the record to say that they would accept this policy. So that's pretty interesting. I've never seen that before. And since I've been doing this, I've seen 5 versions of the SAT. I've never seen the ability to super score across different versions of the test.
Can I jump in with a
Please.
college perspective?
Yes.
Just from a college admissions perspective, I think you're right, Bill, in what colleges are saying. I also think that they're not going to necessarily know until they go through a couple years, at least 1 to 2 years,
Yeah.
of seeing the new digital test in the application process. And we know that testing is just one of many factors to make the admissions decision. So they do depend on grades, the rigor of classes, even more so than the testing. And we've seen that over the years, especially with the test optional COVID movement.
Yeah.
However, that's also shifting back into a lot more schools going back to testing. So I think it's early to even know, because I would suspect already what you've explained, I would suspect that there are going to be a few schools that may have more standards that they're going to require over this abbreviated test. I can see it. I could see it with more like an MIT or a Caltech, or just, again, some really specific ones where they need to see certain math literacy that they may not feel as confident on the SAT, but it's so early to know.
I think that's a really good point. And Stacy, what would that mean to you? Like maybe they're looking at AP tests in addition to the SAT/ACT, something like that.
Yeah.
Okay.
And APs aren't necessarily required because not all schools offer APs.
Right.
So they can't necessarily require it. But if I was like advising a student in a particular school like an MIT or a Caltech, which MIT went back to requiring, testing for this year, which most schools are waiting one more year, and they're going to start up for the 2022-2024 application season. But MIT realized it's still a significant indicator for them. So I would say that if you are on that trajectory, and let's say you don't go to a school that offers AP, or if you're in an IB curriculum and you don't take your IB exams until senior year, which that's the most common, then I would say I would probably be advising that student to try to get a couple of AP tests in, or some other way of showing advanced college level work, which could also be college classes in the summer or things like that. I mean, it would be a very specific case. So
yeah, and I think, by the same token of school, if we're talking about the MITs of the world, that they've kind of always been looking for that. Like if you're trying to go to MIT, like we said a second ago, the math only goes so far on the SAT. So if you can ace it, okay, that's great, but it doesn't tell you if you can do the advanced math that a school like MIT or Caltech is looking for, right? And to echo something that Stacy said, and we're going to talk about this in a minute, yeah, we're in a test optional world. I mean, to put a fine point on one thing you said, Stacy, I think without question, the rigor of the classes that students are taking right now in high school and their performance in those classes are the two biggest factors in the admissions game, without question. Just yesterday, I had a student, she's doing well on the ACT, but she's stressed and her grades are starting to slip. And I said, let's pump the brakes.
Yes.
Your grades are the priority here. So we're talking about testing tonight because that's the topic of the event. But I just want to be clear, and I'm a testing guy. So you can take this for what it is. Tests are one piece of a bigger puzzle. And we're going to talk about test optional in a second. And in a way, I've really leaned into that phrase. Students have more options for how they're presenting themselves and how they can, do so to their most beneficial effects in this world than they used to because of the way these policies have shifted in the last few years. So it's great points all around. Back to the testing side of things. So we know the colleges are theoretically going to look at these tests the same as one another, old SAT versus new SAT. What are the students saying? So I'll be honest, I was pretty skeptical about the new test when they first announced it. I was probably a little scarred from when they last changed the SAT back in 2016, 2017. Stacy, you remember? It was a mess.
Oh, yes.
The tests were very variable. The scales were all over the map. The prep materials were few and far between. I'm hopeful now, however, that the College Board learned from their past missteps, and they've done a really good job rolling this thing out. So we work with a fair number of international test takers. Without exception, everybody had a good experience on the SAT earlier this year. And that both means that they, the test was run smoothly. the administration didn't have any hiccups, and that they felt good about the experience overall. A lot of our students at MindFish took the PSAT within the last week or two. Many people shared positive feedback with me about that test. We'll see, but I had a lot of students tell me they thought it was easy. Now, that could go either way for sure, and always does. But they all had a smooth experience. There were no, glitches with the digital format. I didn't hear any horror stories about power outages or broken laptops and stuff like this. Now, back in 2020, when the College Board tried to run AP tests online, it was a nightmare. So again, I had some, I think, well-justified suspicion about this test, but it seems to be going really well. Now, the exact impression, the exact experience that students are going to have is going to vary depending on who they are and what their academic background is. I've seen a lot of our students who score very equally across digital and paper SATs. And I've seen a pretty big differential on either side of that comparison. We've got some students who are doing really well on the digital test and less well on the paper SAT. And we have some students who are the exact opposite. So the choice about which test to take, and again, we're also going to talk about the ACT in a second, is really an individual choice. So I'm here to share some kind of generalizations in this, but I don't want you to leave this meeting tonight and say like, oh yeah, my kid's an ACT student, or my daughter's going to take the digital SAT. That's the best test for her. Students really need to try all of the tests they have available to them and see which one's the best fit. That's the last point on this slide. Diagnostic practice tests are essential. And we'll come back to that in a minute.
Bill, can I share? Oh, you're already getting there.
Please, no, go ahead.
I just wanted to share my daughter's experience of taking it last week, but it relates to your second slide, your next slide.
Oh, accommodations.
Yeah, I will tell you, my daughter, she has an IEP, she's dyslexic, and she hates these tests, but I make her do them just to be more prepared. Yeah. And I will tell you, she said it felt really good because she finally felt like she could take a test, because it was the timer helped, the way you could stop for breaks, the reader, even having a reader throughout was just like so helpful that she felt like it was a good pace for her. I was just blown away to support a student with ADHD and dyslexia and her feeling very comfortable for the first time taking one of these tests.
I love it. And that is, potentially a huge opportunity for neurodivergent kids on this new test. One of my close colleagues at MindFish is also dyslexic. Her passion is helping neurodivergent students, both with testing and in their academic lives. She's pretty excited about this test. But it's interesting because historically, the ACT was usually our go-to for students with neurodivergences. And think back about what we said a few minutes ago. One reason for that is because historically the ACT's use of language is more straightforward and less tricky than the SAT's use of language. That might be changing. Now, I'm thrilled that your daughter had a good experience on this test. To go back to what I was saying earlier, that doesn't mean that every neurodivergent kid is going to be a digital SAT kid, right?
Yeah.
And so I really, if you take one thing away from this, to me, it's choose the path that's best for your student. And you need to do a little bit of research and a little bit of playing around with the various tests to figure out what that is. But to your point, Stacy, you hit on a few accommodations that are featured both on the old test and in a different version on the new digital SAT. You talked about pausing. So some students get extra breaks. They can take breaks on the test when they want to. In this new digital format, you can literally, if you're one of those students, you can just press pause and take a breath. In some cases, stand up, walk around, come back to the test, right? Let's think about some other accommodations. Some students have 50% extra time. Some students have more than that. It's an individual digital test. So the timer will time you per your accommodations, right? You mentioned a reader as well. So historically, there would be a human reader. Like if I were taking the test and Stacy was my reader, she would read the questions to me out loud. Now it's a digital reader. And actually, I heard some human reader stories on the PSAT recently. I think there's still some kinks going on with that. But theoretically it's supposed to be a digital reader. For students with visual impairments, you can zoom the text. We used to have to do this crazy thing where, you know, a couple times a year I'd have a student with a visual impairment and you'd have to order like really big tests for them on paper, which it worked, but you know, it's 2023. And if you can zoom, you zoom this thing on your screen, it's a heck of a lot easier in a lot of ways. So again, different students are different, but we do think that students with ADHD might be a good fit for the digital SAT. Think about those reading passages we were talking about. Shorter passages, one question on each topic, rather than a page and a half with 12 questions attached to it. For some students with ADHD, that could be very positive. You also mentioned dyslexia. I think it can go either way. Now, I wrote here, it might be challenging for students with dyslexia if the screen is an impediment for those students, right? And think about what we're talking about specifically on math. If I'm doing a math question on my screen and then I'm transcribing the math to my scratch paper, doing my work on paper, and then copying it back up to the screen, that can, based on the specifics of a student's neurodivergent, that could be challenging, or it might not be, right? It depends on the student. But in the historical tests, when we have like Scantron forms and the paper test, some students who have different learning differences have trouble like bubbling in the right bubble, even if they did the right work on their page. And I see that that could be, exacerbated by going from screen to paper and then back to screen. Again, depends on the students. We saw the Desmo calculator earlier for students with dyscalculia, or in some cases dysgraphia. That could be a really powerful tool if they've got this great calculator in front of them on the screen. An interesting thing about the new test is the last set of bullets here on this slide. If you have accommodations, you can actually request a paper version of the digital test, which might sound like a paradox, and it kind of is. They call it the linear version of the SAT. Theoretically, if you have accommodations, you can request it. Whether the College Board grants that request is a different process, but you can request a paper version of the test. Some students might be better served by doing that if the new format of the digital test is not a good fit for them. I mentioned my colleague Haley, who's dyslexic and is passionate about working with neurodivergent students. I called her earlier today as I was getting ready for this presentation and asked for some more feedback on the accommodations process. And she said, if she were to read a student's neuropsych report and see their practice test scores, she would be very comfortable recommending digital SAT versus linear SAT versus ACT. But that's a lot of information, right? These neuropsych reports are very detailed. So again, I'm giving you some generalizations, but not saying what the right fit is for every student, because every student's different. And especially when we're talking about students with learning differences, knowing exactly how they perform and react and think in these various modes is really important. And we'll talk about this again, but I really advocate practice tests and doing some research to figure out which test is the right fit for which student. This slide might be in the wrong place, but quick question, like, why are they doing this? I said earlier it's 2023. I mean, I think part of it is that, it's kind of staying current with the times. Most standardized tests are digital now, and you can present these tests in powerful ways. College Board has also talked a lot about security and ease of testing administration. And with that, access to testing and more equitable testing for different population cohorts. I think there might be something to that. Again, I have seen that the tests this year have been very stable and well administered, so I'm optimistic. Slightly more cynical side of me thinks the College Board is doing this just to stay relevant, right? To stay at the top of the news cycle, to have people, especially in this test optional era, to have people still thinking about the SAT, still talking about the SAT, have nerds like me talking about the test to you guys bias, right? That's all in the College Board's interest. But, largely I think that the new test is going to be a good option for a lot of kids. So what about the ACT? Still here and is not really changing. And that's sort of consistent with the way the ACT has done things for a lot of years. The College Board is based in Manhattan. They're sort of like this, the more innovative and more kind of forward-thinking testing organization. ACT is based in Iowa City, Iowa. It's no knock about the Midwest. I'm an Illinois kid myself, but they're a little bit more traditional, a little bit more, resistant to change. And the ACT's really embraced that with the new SAT coming out. They've sort of dug in their heels and said, we're not changing. You guys know how our test works. Colleges, you all trust us. We're still here. We're still doing what we've always done. SAT is really appealing to the younger generations and the actual students who are taking the test. So, they're sort of differentiating themselves in that way, and we'll see how it plays out. ACT is much more similar to the old version of the SAT. Longer passages, longer sections. The test is about 3 hours long overall, so it's a longer test as a whole. We've got on the ACT English, math, reading, and science. We've got 4 subject categories instead of 2 now on the SAT. SAT is just verbal and math. ACT is a little bit more broken up. ACT is still a great fit for a lot of students. And we'll talk about this in a second, but we have 80% of our students at MindFish take one test of each type. And we do a head-to-head comparison and sit down and talk about what they thought about the test and pick which test is the best fit for each student individually. I still think that's a really good idea. We talked about accommodations. ACT is still a really good fit for students who have multi-day accommodations. Theoretically, you can get them on the SAT, but it's much less common than having a multi-day test on the ACT. By multi-day, I mean some students test over 4 separate days. They do English one day, reading another day, math a third day, science on the 4th day. Or maybe they'll do 2 sections on one day and 2 sections on another day. ACT has always been very forthcoming with those types of multi-day accommodations. And for some students with neurodivergences, that is still the best option because they really benefit from breaking the test up in that manner. Now, ACT is sort of like the more traditional group, but they did launch like what I consider a token digital ACT pilot that's coming out in December. They're letting 5,000 students take an ACT on a computer in December. But it's literally the exact same test that students will see on paper on the same day. It's not adaptive. It's not, this new fancy testing platform like the SAT has. I don't know, maybe that's their attempt to stay relevant and stay in the conversation, but it's really not of interest to me. And actually, I was helping a student with this earlier today. You can't even take that test anywhere in Colorado, the digital ACT. So it's very limited. And I think they're kind of like kicking the tires and seeing if they might want to do something in that vein, but I wouldn't pay it much attention. So which test is right for individual students? I've said this a few times, but I really encourage students to take a practice test of the digital SAT and a practice ACT and see which one they score better on. Notice that I didn't mention the paper SAT as part of that comparison. There are only 2 more paper SATs ever. One is on November 4th. You couldn't sign up for it right now, even if you wanted to. And the last one is on December 2nd. That's way too soon to prepare for. So if you're taking some diagnostic tests to try to figure out which test to take, to me, the paper SAT is already water under the bridge, and we're just talking about the digital test versus the ACT. I've got a small graphic on here, which is the concordance tables that equate SAT and ACT scores. These are freely available. It was last updated in 2018. Believe it or not, this is the most current one out there. The College Board believes that the new SAT is so equatable with the old SAT that they're not planning to change the concordance tables. So let's say your student took a PSAT last week and she scored, let's say, I don't know, pick a random number, 1,100. And she takes an ACT practice test that she finds online and she gets a 25. probably the ACT is a better fit, right? 25, as you can see, equates to a 1210. That's significantly higher than 1100. I had exactly this happen today, if I can remember the numbers. I met with a family like 2 hours ago, and this student had a 26 on the ACT, and he had 1120 on the digital SAT. And I was like, okay, ACT all day. A lot of students, it'll be much more similar. And then you need to talk more about their experience and their goals and, you know, some of the details about the types of content on the test and maybe accommodations and neurodivergence and all these other factors. But just comparing the scores can be really helpful in and of itself. And again, colleges view SAT and ACT equally as well, which was not always the case back when I took these tests in a beautiful era called the 1990s. It was very much geographic, like the East Coast was SAT territory. Midwest, where I grew up, was ACT territory. I took both because I was looking at schools all over the country. That's a thing in the past. Every school in the country will look at SAT, be it paper or digital, and ACT equally. So it's all about which test is the best fit for which students. And I cited, you know, the student I met earlier today who had a much higher ACT score. I've had students who have absolutely been the opposite of that, and their digital SAT score is much higher than the ACT. They're going to take the digital SAT in the spring. I have some links at the end of this whole thing. And by the way, we'll send out the PDF to you all if you're interested, but I have some links at the end where you can find online digital tests if you're interested. Or excuse me, online practice test, digital or paper if you're interested.
And you also have the video. You also have access to the video and the PowerPoint. Yeah.
Awesome. Awesome. Stacy hinted at this earlier, and this is sort of like the you know, $1,000 question. Do I even need to test at all? I thought all the schools dropped their testing requirements. The short answer, which is a bad answer, is maybe, right? And we'll talk about why. Most colleges, top bullet point here, are indeed test optional. Let's be really clear what that means. It means you're not required to submit a test score, but you can. And if you do submit a test score, colleges will probably look at it. Notice how vague all this is. We're in this weird new world where there's a lot of uncertainty. Some colleges will look at that score and assign a great deal of value to it. Some colleges won't. This is a tangent, but there's this huge pool of data called the common data set. And schools literally say, like, how important are test scores in your process? And schools will say, very important, not that important, whatever. So they're not all looking at test scores in the same way. But let's talk more about test optional. Most schools in the country are test optional. They do not require tests for admissions. However, there's a huge range of policies within that overall umbrella of test optional. My second bullet here are a few examples. UCLA, which is a public school in the University of California system, is test free. They're even further than test optional. They legally are not allowed to look at your test scores. They cannot consider them. CU Boulder, here in my backyard in Colorado, is test optional. They'll look at your scores as you send them, but you're not required to send them. Auburn is sort of a weird one. Test preferred. They're literally like, you don't have to send your scores, but we really want you to. So they like scores a lot. And, you know, we can infer that that means if you don't send them, that it might not be looked that, you know, highly upon. And then you've got schools like Purdue, which actually require students to send scores. You also mentioned MIT earlier, Stacy. MIT is required. Also, just real quick, Florida, Georgia, Tennessee, yes, public schools in the Southeast all require test scores. So I've got this little graphic. It's probably hard for you to see on your monitors, but some schools really don't care about test scores, and some schools actually do. If you look at this chart, like all the way to the left, you can see two blue bars. That's Northeastern University in Boston. They're admitting students with scores and without scores at basically the exact same rate. Look all the way to the right. You can barely see it, but you can see two bars. The red one's much higher than the one next to it. That's Boston College, also in Boston. they're admitting people who send scores almost 3 times as often as students who don't. So again, it depends on the school and it depends where your student is applying. It's a very individual choice. But if I had to have like one conclusion about whether to test or not, it would be the bullet in the middle of this screen. Keeping options open is a good idea for many students. I use a cheesy metaphor about a toolbox. If you have a good test score in your college toolbox, that's a nice tool to have access to. How you're going to use that tool, if you're going to use it, is a different question. And it really depends on where you're applying and what you're trying to do. And this is where somebody like Stacy and her team at The Best You can be really, really helpful in this process. Stacy's going to say, all right, we've got these 8 or 10 schools you're applying to. We're going to send your scores here, 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 and here, and we're not going to send them to some of these other schools, right? And it really depends what their average scores are for the freshman class. It depends what major you're applying to in some cases. There's a lot of decision points that go into this. But not having a score at all sort of leaves you lacking one tool in that toolbox, and you may need it. At the 11th hour, you might say, you know what? I actually do want to apply to Purdue. I do want to apply to Georgia Tech. If you don't have a score, it's going to be a problem. And again, let me put a fine point on it. I'm not saying every student needs scores or needs to submit scores to every school they apply to at all, but it's a good option to keep open. And sometimes you can determine at the beginning of the process that actually you don't need that option. I have a student I was talking to, we did a little bit of work with him, and he got an athletic commitment to play lacrosse. And the coach is like, you do not need to take a test. Like, great, we're done, right? He worked with us for like a month, which is shorter than most students would, and that was it. He doesn't need the score, but it's a good option to have open. The real operative question is second from the bottom here. Does the score add value to your application or not? And again, Stacy and people in her position who know what they're doing can tell you if it adds value or not versus your GPA, versus your extracurriculars, versus everything else on your profile. That's the real question. It can help sometimes for scholarship, for class placement, for athletic recruitment. In other cases, it doesn't matter. So again, my kind of punchline for this is it's a good option to have. You know, don't eliminate it from your toolbox preemptively, but it's also probably not the biggest priority for a lot of students either.
Can I just say one thing, just real
Please.
quick? Just one real quick thing is that also many of the schools that decided to go test optional temporarily through COVID are now rethinking their policies and will make their final policy for 2024. So this may shift into more schools requiring testing versus not. So a lot of them say they were test optional temporarily through the 2023 admission cycle, which is what we're in. And
3
that
years
they,
of COVID. Yep.
yeah, yes, through that. And so a lot of them are starting to rethink for 2024. So I'm even advising more juniors right now, plan on taking for now, and then you can make the decision later of whether you really need to follow through or not based on your scores. Just because I still feel like we're in limbo right now with this whole test optional thing.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, and what's the timing on that, Stacy? When will they announce their policies for 2024?
After the application season, so typically over the summer.
Right.
So you really do need to be in it. If you're a junior, you're prepping through the school year. You may be testing over the summer and maybe the fall as your last time, but you really do need to think about it in your testing plan for this school year as a junior.
That's, yeah, good point. For example, I mentioned Purdue earlier this year. They said we're requiring tests again. And so if you want to go to Purdue, they have great engineering programs, for example, and you're a second semester junior and you've never tested or prepped, all of a sudden you're a few months out from submitting your app and you need to do the whole testing process. That's challenging and it's stressful. Yeah. And I didn't mention it yet, but third bullet from the bottom here, I sort of hinted at this. This is the important thing. Just because you test doesn't mean that anybody sees your scores.
Correct.
That is your choice, right? So you can go through the process and say, you know what? Purdue needs them, so I'm submitting them, but this other school I'm choosing not to, right? And you can take it 3-4 times. Hopefully you don't need to, but you can take it multiple times and choose only to submit your best scores, right? So you're totally in the driver's seat. This is part of what I mentioned earlier when I said students have more options in this test optional age. You can pick and choose which schools see your scores and which don't. The resources here, a bunch of links, going to be better on the PDF, but a bunch of, further stuff. I've got my contact information here. If you ever want to talk about testing, I'm here to do it anytime. It's what I do all day, every day. I know it seems glamorous, but give me a shout if you want to talk about testing. I'd love to at any time.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you, thank you. And a couple of people had to leave, and so they
Sure.
were saying goodbye on the chat. But I'm wondering, Jennifer or Audie, if you have any questions that you would like to ask. I had a list of questions, but you just answered all of them. And so I know I don't have any other questions to ask. You really went through everything. So we'll just hold on a sec to see if Jennifer or Audie, you have any questions. No, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, it's wonderful.
Thank you both.
Yeah, wonderful. So we'll email you the video and also the PowerPoint. So if you have any other questions, you can follow up with Bill or us at the Best View as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, thanks for being here. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Thanks, Jennifer.
Thanks.